A very good afternoon to one and all present here today for the IVDR Celebration Week, and we are back with another powerful session where we have Greer Deal from Global Regulatory Services and we have Stephen Griffin from Health Innovation Hub Ireland. Hello, Greer. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing this afternoon?
Doing good, thanks.
Yeah,
Hi,
that's
Jay.
great.
How are you? Thanks for having us.
Yeah. And in today's session, we are going to talk about where to start in order to launch an IVD medical device onto the EU market. And there is a lot of things revolving around launching your medical device onto the market and placing them onto the market. And I'm sure our experts today, Greer and Stephen, they are going to give you great insights into all of these formalities and how and whom to approach, when, where, and how. So, yes, not to forget, IVDR Celebration Week is brought to you by Media Limited, powered by Global Regulatory Services, with our resource partners, which includes Galway Chamber, Medilink Midlands, FRTLE Development, Xenon Health Solutions, GS1 Ireland, Health Innovation Hub Ireland, Embassy of India, Dublin, Ireland. And with all of the resources, experts, and all the insights, we want to make sure that the entire medtech ecosystem is hashtag IVDR ready. So let's not waste our more time and let's get into the session. And Stephen, I would like to ask you, what exactly is Health Innovation Hub Ireland all about?
Yeah, well, listen, thank you very much for having me. It's great to get this opportunity to speak about such important issues. So the Health Innovation Hub, we are a joint initiative between the Department of Health and the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment in Ireland, funded by and supported by Enterprise Ireland and the HSE. So what we are on the ground is we are an entity in 3 different locations, one in Galway, one in Dublin and one in Cork, and we're co-located between academic institutions and the HSE. So in Galway, it's the National University of Ireland Galway and the CELTA Hospital Group, which are 7 hospitals on the west coast of Ireland. And in Cork, it's the South-Southwest Hospital Group and UCC, and in Dublin, and MTU, and in Dublin then it's St. James, it's Trinity College Dublin and the Dublin Midlands Hospital Group. So altogether, we're affiliated with 23 different hospitals and their community healthcare organizations. So what's that mean? Half of our team are like me, where we come from various backgrounds within either from industry, academia, and others, and the other half of our team then are healthcare professionals working in the healthcare system at the moment. So what service do we offer? We were set up to support Irish companies who are looking to engage with the clinical experts who have the expertise to inform them on the development of their products or services as they want to bring them towards market. And we do this really by engaging with companies in various different manners, understanding what their needs are and who they need to speak to within the healthcare system about their product and whatever that process may be for how it's used, etc. in healthcare. And using our healthcare team, we can arrange those meetings, focus groups, depending on we have 3 different types of services that we provide for companies, which I can explain later. But in a nutshell, this is what we do. We provide that support piece for companies who want to learn more about the healthcare system, have the experts look at their product services, give them feedback, or even pilot their product or service in the healthcare system.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And Greer, I would also like to ask you a question with regards to GRS and Media. What services can we provide to our clients in this space when they are looking to launch their product onto the market?
Yes, absolutely. So GRS is the parent company based in Great Britain, covering the whole of the life sciences. And we are a network of established specialists all around the world with the in-country expertise as well as the regulatory, technical, quality compliance know-how. And then Media was spun out a few years ago because the medtech sector is absolutely booming, and even more so with the diagnostics because of the COVID pandemic. And we wanted to have a dedicated team of people who could support the diagnostic and medtech industry as a whole. So they're based in the lovely city of Galway in Ireland, and they focus on regulatory affairs, quality compliance in the medtech sector, but also your borderline products, which could be borderline with fitness wellness devices, and the more complex combination drug device products. And through Medidia, we're able to offer EU authorised representative services and person responsible for regulatory compliance. And the latter role, the PRRC, is a new role which has been brought in by the new regulations. And so for diagnostic companies, it's very much a key role as from the 26th of May 2022. And actually, you should really be having someone in place now. So they will make sure that you are compliant with the regulations. So anyone seeking to commercialize their diagnostics, they need to be thinking about their regulatory pathway, their regulatory strategy, so that they are compliant with the right requirements, the right regulations, the right standards and guidances for Europe and other target markets.
Okay, thank you so much, Greer, for highlighting those services out. And Stephen, the next question will be for you, where I was wondering, why is it a good option for companies or manufacturers to come to Health Innovation Hub Ireland?
Well, I suppose it's a good option for a few reasons. One is we support Irish companies, and we've engaged with companies in the past who have used our services for the first time, having gone abroad to do the work. They've either gone over to the US or they've gone the UK or to mainland Europe to meet clinical personnel or opinion leaders to give advice or guidance on what it is they're doing. So it supports the whole ecosystem in Ireland. If you're trying to develop or build a product in Ireland, that you can engage with the users or the user base in Ireland in the first instance. That's one. I suppose the other reasons is it's good to engage early with who your potential users are, or your prescriber, or the person who's going to order the product, particularly if they're, say, a frontline healthcare person who has to do it. The ones that are doing it every day, that know the problems. And it's like that. Rather, you can ask a question instead of trying to develop something and show somebody the product. If you can engage with them first to verify that the need is there on the ground, in their opinion, and build from there. And if they have prototypes, then to get that informed opinion on the prototype, or if you have regulatory considerations that have to be addressed, that you can also find the people to, I suppose, to do that, the users, I guess, that to do based on the expertise and advice from regulatory experts.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for highlighting one of these facts. And Greer, what I would ask is, now let's consider there is a MedTech university project, and the students think that they would like to get their idea to life. What are the first steps for them?
If we're looking at the fact that we're regulatory affairs and quality compliance, then it's basically looking at the regulatory requirements. And what I mean, you have to backtrack actually, because the very, very first thing that these students, these entrepreneurs need to do is actually define the device. So what is it? I mean, they may think they know exactly what it is, but you've got to define it according to the regulations. So you need to look at the intended purpose. Why are you developing this? What is the point of it? And does it even have a medical purpose? So once you've defined it, then you can go through and determine what your regulatory pathway is. So that's the start of your regulatory strategy. And it's so important to have a regulatory strategy because it acts as your roadmap. So you define your device and then you have your roadmap. And that is so useful for investors, because investors love to see these documents that can be part of your business plan, part of your application for funding. And why investors like seeing it is because it demonstrates that you've taken advice, specialist advice, and you now understand the challenges that are ahead of you to develop and commercialize your product. And you understand the costs that are involved, you understand the timelines, and you understand the key stakeholders and what you need to do when. So what you're doing in effect is you're mitigating the risk for someone who is thinking of investing in your company and your technology. So that's my advice: define the product and get a regulatory strategy in place.
Can I add to that as well?
Of course.
Definitely.
If you take your example there of students or anyone working in a university who may be trying to commercialize some technology that they're developing, it's often the case where they haven't considered not just what the regulatory pathway should be, which will clearly outline some of the tests and methodologies that they need to do when developing a prototype, but they may have overlooked certain other aspects too as well. So even starting with the regulatory pathway in mind very early on will help flesh out the other sides of it, like around your IP, etc., and really kind of without spending money on developing something, you know what you need from the get-go. You haven't kind of wasted any time or money, because ultimately it takes a long time to get these things going. So getting that regulatory pathway clearly defined early is, and what the product is, whether it actually needs to be a regulated medical device or I think is important too. And we see a lot now, and I won't pick on universities or anything like that, but from all walks they'll come in and may not have considered that it is a medical device or an in vitro diagnostic and requires that level of oversight or regulatory approval.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we've had examples of both scenarios whereby a manufacturer has decided, they can, under the old IVD directives, they've self-declared as a lowest risk classification diagnostic, and they've just slapped a CE mark on and have made it medical. But actually, when you look at it and where it's used and how it's used, there is no medical reason to use it. And so it's actually not a medical device and therefore not a diagnostic. So, and then we have other companies who say, oh, there is no medical purpose to this device that I'm developing. And then when you get into the nitty gritty of how they're using it, how they're presenting it, the complexity and what it does, you actually go, well, actually, this is medical and you can't get away from it. So we've had both scenarios. So it's very important that you define your device so you know whether it's medical or not.
And particularly with the early stage entrepreneurs, or even if it's an innovation coming out from a more established company, that's one of the questions that you need to ask: is it a medical device, or does it have a medical purpose? Because there's a huge implications if you've missed something that you should have caught early.
Yeah, and also there are times when you can a legal manufacturer can choose whether something's going to be medical or not. So if it's going to be more of an educational tool, for example, then it's knowing how far they can go and what the flags are that would flip them over into being into medical. So that's something that we help with in terms of regulatory strategy. And the reason they do that is because they ultimately want to be a medical company, but they don't have the funds. Because, Stephen, like you said, there's huge implications being in the medical device diagnostic sector. There are costs, etc. So if you can minimize your overheads and start off with something that is non-medical and, be able to develop your technology later to move into the medical space, and that is actually quite a common scenario that we're coming across.
And I think that's a hugely sensible strategy as well for a lot of companies. We would see, I think you mentioned borderline, is that what you called them earlier? Yeah, we'd see a few of those, particularly in kind of the digital technologies, our digital health, where they may or may not be a medical device, but they do tend to stay on the on one side of the fence. I suppose a really good example is probably the Apple atrial defibrillation sensor, where they had the product on the market for a long time, gathered a load of data, and then analyzed the data to show it could detect a clinically significant signal, and then switched gears. But they
Yeah.
had, they had a really good baseline to work from. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So thank you so much for highlighting all of these facts. And while we were talking about regulatory strategy, Greer, would you be able to highlight what are the aspects of a regulatory strategy?
Yeah, if we can just share that something I prepared earlier, Jay. So I just want to recap over what a regulatory strategy is. So I mentioned about it being a pathway. So it literally is defining the regulatory pathway to commercialization for your target market. So if Europe's your target market, then obviously you're looking at the IVD regulation and the medical device regulation. But it can also open doors to other territories as well. So you need to be thinking about that. So you need to be thinking about your longer term goals if you want to go global and beyond Europe, or whether it's Europe is your main market. And as I've already said, it encompasses the key milestones and decision points, that you need to address as you go through that pathway. And then you're looking at your goals, what the regulatory landscape is in Europe, and where the risks are. It will identify the risks for you as well. And as I've mentioned already, it is a roadmap. So it's a very structured approach. Once you've got it all together and confirmed, it's a very structured approach to how you're going to commercialize your device. And of course, the ultimate goal is that once you get to the end of it, it gives the patients access to your technology. So the different aspects of the regulatory strategy, I'll just move on to. So this is specifically to answer your question there, Jay. So regulatory strategy, there are three key areas, and I've already covered off a little bit of this, and that's you've got to define the device and get your risk classification. So I've covered off about defining your device, but what a lot of diagnostic companies actually don't appreciate is that first off, you've got to have that medical purpose, and actually you've got to meet the definition of being a medical device under the medical device regulation. If you meet that definition, then you need to revisit it and go, okay, well, I believe my device is a diagnostic. So then you go to the IVD regulation and you look at the definition of a diagnostic and go, oh yeah, it does meet that, or it doesn't. Now, if you're fairly new to this, but you've come up with this amazing idea, this amazing concept, I would strongly recommend that you seek expert and objective viewpoint on the definition of your device. And that's because too often companies or entrepreneurs will say, oh, I've Googled and I reckon my device is, class group A for a diagnostic, for example. And most companies want to be a group A because they want to self-declare, they don't have to engage with a notified body. But actually the reality is that between the directive, the IVD directive, the old directive, and the new regulation, they're going to be up classified to a higher risk classification. And so you need someone to walk through the whole process of definition, risk classification, looking at the implementing rules being brought in by the new regulation, which will then determine what your risk classification is. And if you get an outside expertise coming in to do that for you, you'll get an objective overview of that. And it means that you'll get it right from the start. You get your pathway right from the start. So I've emphasized the importance of device definition and classification. The second aspect is compliance requirements. So what do you need to comply with? So, if it's a medical device, then you're looking at the medical device regulation, but then you're moving into the diagnostic. If you meet that definition, you come under the diagnostic regulation. And then there's a whole raft of standards and guidance that you would need to comply with. There's MDCG guidance. It's called guidance, but actually the notified bodies expect everybody to follow it. Even though it's guidance, you think it would be voluntary, but it's not. Follow it, please. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. So it's understanding all the requirements that you need to meet. And then finally, the last bit of your strategy is very important. Diagnostics devices, invariably they're made up of many different components that can come from anywhere, from all over the world. And you as the legal manufacturer, if you're the legal manufacturer, that's something you need to define and determine. If you are the company placing the device onto the EU market, your name and address is going to be on there. You need to have control over your supply chain, and you need to establish the roles and responsibilities of your supply chain. And that's something that the regulations, the new incoming regulation is placing greater emphasis on, is control over that supply chain. So make sure you've got your quality agreements in place. Make sure you do your due diligence on these companies that are supplying you, because they are a critical supplier if they are producing a key component to your diagnostic that you're going to place on the market. So as we've seen that, political unrest, the Ukraine war, of course, pandemic, that really did highlight where people were very reliant on one supplier, and suddenly that supply was lost. So you've got to make sure you have your contingency and everything. So those are the key areas: device definition and classification, compliance requirements, compliance ownership. So basically supply chain, roles and responsibilities. And then all of that will then give you a good idea of cost, timelines, and how complex the requirements are that you need to meet. And then, like I said earlier, if you're looking at the European market, but what about beyond that? So you need to consider how the requirements may differ between the different territories. And that's particularly relevant with the fact we've had Brexit, and Great Britain has a different regulatory mechanism now to Europe. So all of that highlights the importance of having a regulatory strategy, and those are the key areas.
Thank you so much, Greer, for highlighting the regulatory strategy. And definitely, regulatory strategy will serve as a basis of various different plans. And I was going through some literature online, and I could see that the regulatory strategy serves as a base for a marketing plan, because it helps you with market access and where to go, where not to go. And it also helps you to impress your investors, because through a regulatory strategy, it shows that you have a well-thought plan of action in place. Thank you so much, Greer, for highlighting the aspects. And see, when I consider, of course, regulatory is not the only element that people will be looking at, and you, as an innovation hub, provide so many different services. What are the most in-demand services that the companies look out for?
It is access to the users, really. And they have different, I suppose, agendas for when they engage with those clinical users or prescribers. We would see a lot of work around the voice of the customer, first of all. So it's early stage understanding that the need, what is needed, what it should be, and then moving on then to when they're at kind of a prototype stage, or they have their minimal viable product. It is then getting that kind of critical feedback for two reasons. One is probably to get that the kind of commercial signals that they're going in the right direction, that there's no usability issues. It's easy to use. It fits in line with the current standard of practice, or what the particular users are used to. And then it can get quite a bit more technical then, where you might be ticking some of the boxes that would fall under the regulatory concerns, whereas they might want to do design validation work, or the instruction for use piece, and other aspects, it's kind of it depends what they want, but we would see a lot of work in that kind of area. Now it is quite broad, but it's before a product is ready for market, so it's to ensure that they have met all the milestones that they need to, probably part of your regulatory plan. Now we wouldn't cover things like clinical trials or that. There are other groups that do that. But in terms of the ones that we can help on, we do try and deliver. And then there are the groups that come in, they from a diagnostic perspective, to understand, let's say, the flow within an acute setting. So when a patient comes in, who orders the test, who takes the sample, or where is it sent, what that process is, and when are the results delivered back to the person who ordered it, and what's that timeline, etc. And can it then, is there room here to innovate, or to change, or to introduce a new methodology, and where then could there be barriers? It's not simply of, oh, we've got a new test, but the training up of it, is this something that's completely new to the team that would normally, whether it's a lab test or a point of care or whatever. And then even look and then say, understanding how tests are ordered from outside the acute system, so in primary care or that. So really understanding the mechanism within the healthcare system. And then I suppose ultimately, a lot of companies are interested in not just the users, but the payers. And Greer, you'd mentioned stakeholders, and yeah, you understand that your stakeholders is a huge huge piece of the puzzle, or the plan for any company. So who will pay for it, and where are the costs associated with the current standards? Yeah, yeah. I suppose if we have worked with companies in the past where they have come in looking to understand that kind of particular pathway, and they had an idea of where their product would fit, and it was a point of care diagnostic for fairly severe, but unfortunately quite common infection, and they had it locked down to a particular department. It was the emergency department, but shadowing the emergency people around for 2 days, they learned then that that wasn't the area where it's used, or that it had any impact really. It was further down the patient pathway if they're in ICU or something like that. So it helped them kind of pivot on what they were doing. Another piece of work we did as well with a different company was, I suppose, I think it might be around the verification stage of assay development. So company had their assay validated, and they wanted to kind of compare it to standards to tests that were already in use. So we engaged a microbiology department in one of the hospitals to run the tests in parallel and to test them out, and they found that they correlated quite well. So they did enough of them to be significant so that they could move forward with their product. And as part of, while we don't do clinical trials or any of that sort of stuff, we can get access to the people who do the tests, but also to the samples. Now, there are ethical considerations and all that sort of stuff, but there are processes in place, particularly within the healthcare system, within hospitals, and that there are ethics recs, or committees, sorry, that and we have quite a bit of experience working with them, or working with the application. So we're there to, it's a daunting piece of a it's a large document, but it is quite standard. And when you're looking for samples, particularly clinical samples, they are available, as long as the right checks and balances are in place in terms of how they're handled and how they're disposed of and what they're used for and what you do with the data and all that. But it's all around. And you mentioned mitigating risk, which is a big thing for investors or anyone really looking at a business. But it's the same with getting access to samples, and that you just mitigate the risk of anything adverse happening with the samples, the data, or where the samples came from. I'm probably speaking a bit too much here now.
No. I was going to say, Stephen, that I find it amazing the number of innovators and entrepreneurs who they develop something that they think is absolutely fantastic, and try to commercialize it, and they haven't even tested the water. They haven't gone to talk to these clinical people like at Health Innovation Hub, that you can give them access to, where they can actually trial it, or talk to someone about how they would position that particular device. It could be the most amazing technology. It can be absolutely whizzy, but if no one wants it or needs it, there's no point.
Yeah, no, it's so common, but I think that's how we're built as people. That you come up with an idea, you think it probably is great, but you've developed a technology that's looking for a problem to solve, as opposed to identifying a problem and then building a technology or a system to address that. And I know the likes of there's great supports in Ireland from groups like Enterprise Ireland and the local enterprise offices, and other organizations that support the development of all sorts of businesses. That this is kind of it's nearly the first question they'll ask you when you go into them looking for funding is, what's the problem you're trying to solve, as opposed to what's your amazing technology. It's almost secondary.
Unless you're Apple and you create a market for smartphones.
Yeah.
Did we know that we needed a smartphone? No.
But that's it too, isn't it? It's like it's the Apple, it's the Facebooks, it's these companies that created a market, as opposed to the ones that are going into established markets or addressing needs. And there have been some fantastic diagnostics and medical devices in the past, let's say last 50 years, but in the last 10, 15 years too, that have they've gone so far back in like the prognosis of a disease or an indication that they literally have stopped it in its tracks before it becomes an issue. And they're really, if you're going after a problem, early detection or trying to mitigate it altogether is where you are you haven't just created a market, but you've also killed another market on beyond where you fit in. But yeah, it is massive, the amount of ideas, I suppose, that come in, and it's really difficult for people to let go of a good idea too. It's once you learn the process of the first time, if it's not working, or not that the product isn't working, but if the idea isn't selling, and that you can tear the bandage off, and you've set yourself goals, and if you haven't reached them, that you can shelve it for a while. I won't say walk away, because you probably never will, but to move on to something else.
Yes, thank you so much for highlighting all of these factors. And we mentioned about many pitfalls while we were talking about it. But this question can be for both of you. Are there any common pitfalls that you have come across that affects the IVD product or the product that is being developed, apart from the problem and the solution?
I'll jump off quickly. Sometimes, particularly, I won't say we see a lot of them, but they do kind of spring to mind, are companion diagnostics. And often you'll see a companion diagnostic that is just a diagnostic because the therapy hasn't been invented yet. But they're trying to place it in that, we know this particular, whatever it is, whatever indication or disease, that we can now categorize people by risk, and they'll be susceptible to these particular treatments that block these antagonists or whatever receptors, but there's nothing there yet. I don't know if that's something that you see much of.
Yeah, I mean, companion diagnostics is a very complex area, and I know that initially a lot of people were thinking that the pharmaceutical companies would be the ones doing all the development in that space, and the answer to that is no. They because they feel that if you have a companion diagnostic for their specific medicine and treatment area, then they're developing it for their use, but actually it should be shared across the whole healthcare system. So the pharmaceutical companies have turned to the entrepreneurs, the startups, the innovators to say, well, you develop something, and then if it looks like it could work well with our medicine, our therapy area, then we'll come in and support you. We'll either offer you the regulatory expertise, the clinical expertise, or actually provide some level of funding. So that's tending to that's really what the trend is in the market at the moment. So yeah. But in terms of pitfalls, I think the classic one, going back to your question, Jay, is incorrectly defining the device. I was alluding to that earlier when, does it actually have a medical purpose? That's the first question. Does it really have a medical purpose? For diagnostics, if they're used in the lab as a general piece of lab equipment, that's just a general piece of lab equipment. You've got to determine whether it actually has a medical purpose. So yeah, you've got to be very careful. You can't declare something as being a device or a diagnostic. You have to go through the hoops and justify and give evidence why it is a device. So that's the first pitfall. Incorrectly defining and classifying your device.
I think even not knowing that you need to classify the device as well is something that we'd see, and I know there are kind of resources online from HPRA or whomever where you can try and figure out where you land, but I'll always say you probably need to talk to an expert early. I mean, it'll.
Yeah, I mean, for someone, so for the Medidia group with GRS, where we can definitely help with defining and classification, but sometimes it can be a bit grey. And in those instances, it's actually very important to go to the competent authority and get their opinion. So, but you don't just go in and say, is it or isn't it? You actually need to go in with an argument as to why you think your device is a diagnostic and what classification it is. And then you enter into a dialogue with the competent authority, who will either agree with you and give a reason why they agree with you, or they'll disagree and give a reason and then tell you what your product is and the risk classification. And then, definitely that's the route that you have to go down. And I've got to say the HPRA, fantastic, very, very supportive. And very informative.
And it's probably important to highlight that that's a very structured process, isn't it? It's not it's very formal. So like that, you need to kind of know what you're getting into, because you can sometimes ask a question only once.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
That's very true. And you can't go back from the answer that you're given.
yeah and I mean, it's again, you can open Pandora's box if you ask a question the wrong way, or if you don't have that if you don't have the expertise yourself, that you haven't at least brought somebody in to guide you on the process, because it could,
yeah,
you can really put yourself at a disadvantage.
And also, if you, I can't go into the specifics of the example, but if the entrepreneur, the company, approaches the competent authority direct without taking any regulatory advice, without getting the terminology right, what I have seen is that they've gone to the competent authority and they've provided a background to the technology, and then they've gone, well, I'd like it to be this lower risk classification, but actually I think it's going to be this. What do you reckon? Well, of course, the competent authority is going to go for the highest risk scenario, because they're all about mitigating risk. So if the highest risk is going to mitigate the most risk, if you see what I mean, then that's where they're going to go for. So because they went in and gave the competent authority choice, the competent authority went for the highest risk classification. And Stephen, like you just said, they couldn't go back from that. That's the way forward they had to go. Whereas they actually could have justified a lower risk classification and positioned their device slightly differently.
And I mean, the point you made about the language that to use as well, that's, I mean, when you know the terms, or when you've been immersed in it for a while, they make sense in the context. But if you're an engineer or an entrepreneur, and your background is in a particular area, and you may well be developing something that's going to be a success, you need to understand everybody speaks slightly differently in the different areas. Like, you can talk about the regulatory side of it, but even sometimes we might have a couple of engineers who've come in to speak to a clinical group, and they'll be speaking in engineering terms, and talking about wavelengths and all sorts of stuff, and and in fairness, like the clinical professions, there are a lot of different groups. Some may understand what they're talking about, some will understand, and then there'll be a lot of people it doesn't make any sense to. So you need to kind of,
Yes.
yeah, have that piece translated almost.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, the entrepreneurs, the companies, they're the people who know the technology inside out, should do. And, they're very, very passionate about their technology. And it's up to the regulatory people, the quality people, the clinical people to interpret that technical speak, that scientific speak, and that passion into a story that the regulators will understand and will be confident in the safety and the quality of the device. So that's where that comes in.
Yeah, it makes so much sense.
Well, it does to us. I hope it does to everyone else.
No, I'm sure that if the audience are not understanding anything, they have the feature to ask their questions using the comment box. So definitely, again, a reminder to all our audiences on all different platforms, on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. If you have any questions, please use the comment box to ask them, and our experts will be there to answer them right now. Or else you can drop an email at mdd@mddltd.com, and we will connect with you and answer all your queries related to in vitro diagnostic regulations. And yes, following on our discussion, Greer, I would like to ask is now, while the regulatory strategy is in place, okay, and the regulations at times can be daunting, what should the companies do when there is so much uncertainty in the market with regards to the regulations?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to there, Jay, is we've got the new IVD regulation coming in on the 26th of May, which is, blink and it'll be here. So only next month. It's not been postponed, but there are, it's a soft application. So there are some key dates, and if people want to log online, then the key dates are actually in previous sessions that we brought up. So, but from the 26th of May 2022, so next month, all IVDs will need to comply with vigilance and post-market surveillance activities brought in by the regulation. So they need to comply with those. It doesn't matter whether you're fully compliant with the IVDR or not. Those are the two key areas that all diagnostic companies must comply with. And new diagnostics and Class A's need to be fully compliant as well from that date. It's in terms of sources of information to make sure that you're up to date. Obviously, people like organisations like Medidia and Global Regulatory Services, utilise them. But I mentioned how helpful the HPRA is. Their website's very, very good. And if you sign up to their newsletter, then they generate a lot of information, and there's free training sessions, etc. as well. And then there's the MDCG guidance that isn't guidance; it's mandatory. And make sure you get onto their newsletter, and and that will help keep you up to date. But there is a key role in your company under the new regulation. The person responsible for regulatory compliance, they will be instrumental in making sure that you are complying with the right requirements and you're complying in the right timeline. So they've got a pivotal role in your company. And as a micro and small company, rather, if you meet that definition, you can actually outsource that role. And again, that's something that Medidia or GRS can provide. And in a way, your micro and small companies are actually tapping into even better expertise, broader expertise in support of that technology. So there are advantages to actually being able to outsource, whereas if you employ someone, then you are limited to that person's knowledge, and it is an individual. And the other thing, just to clarify with that role, is that you can actually appoint several individuals to be a PRRC, but you need to be very clear on what their roles and responsibilities are. So something that you might do, it might consider, is actually, okay, so, you know, we have Class B diagnostics and Class C. Well, we'll have a PRRC who looks after the Group B rather, and we'll have another one that looks after the C. But you've got to be careful that they're not off on holiday at the same time, because they should be able to cover for each other as well. So, because they have to be continuously at the disposal of the legal manufacturer. So remember, it is basically a 24/7 role. Doesn't have legal responsibility, but it is a mandatory requirement. So hope that answers the question, Jay.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Greer. And while we are talking about the market and the market requirements, and especially when the IVD regulations are just around the corner, Stephen, do you see any growth in demand? Are the IVD manufacturers running around?
Well, I suppose I have to answer this from the healthcare side, because we see it more on kind of the needs that are coming in. So part of the work we do is we work a lot with the clinical people, really, and do you have any solutions for this, and what is this? And it is this, it's diagnostics. They come in, a lot of them, looking for faster, better point of care diagnostics, really. So we don't see too much from the company side. We do see companies responding to this, startups and some of these spin outs from the university, as well as the larger companies. Of course, they're all looking at it. But yeah, that point of care diagnostics, and I think I mentioned it at the start, it's not necessarily just within the acute system, but also the in the community care side of things, primary care and GPs. Speaking with the GP recently, that would really change things for them if there was a number of tests that they didn't have to send into a hospital to go through the labs to come back to them, and they have, to have, it would expedite a whole lot of things for both the patient and the healthcare system. I know I'm not giving specifics here, but it is that kind of space that there is an appetite for it. And I suppose probably the other side too is the personal diagnostics as well, for people who are interested in their own health and well-being, that there is are more interested in it, I suppose. There is that there is a growing market there, and that's like, we are seeing more companies in that space for sure.
And I think also that the COVID pandemic has really thrown diagnostics into the limelight, and there's been a lot of innovation as a result, because the world had to react quickly in order to try and provide a solution, or several, obviously multiple solutions, to help deal with the pandemic. And interestingly, governments all around the world actually allowed fast track or emergency use applications to get COVID diagnostics available to healthcare systems rapidly. One point of caution, though, there is that as soon as a government, so if you're, for example, if you're selling into Great Britain, if Great Britain or the UK government should say, actually, we're fine here, the pandemic is completely over, the COVID diagnostic that you've got on that market, if you have only met the minimum requirements because you've gone through the fast track authorization, you will have to withdraw your product from the market with immediate effect, because the emergency is now over. But if you're on there now, and so if you're selling now, and the pandemic hasn't been declared as over, please make sure that you're actually working towards full compliance if you want to stay on the market. So yeah, you shouldn't be sitting on your laurels, as we say. You need to make sure that you're achieving full compliance. But yeah, the pandemic has really thrown the diagnostic sector into the limelight.
I suppose we saw we opened a portal kind of at the start, was in maybe early April of 2020, which is if you have any solutions that'll help with the pandemic effort, please apply here. But there was a huge kind of response in terms of that, like what you're saying, diagnostics, particularly around COVID diagnostics, in response to a particular event. And I wonder, not just from the diagnostic side, but there was supply chains put in place, and then there was distribution, like pharmacies set up to administer. There was to do the swabs and all that. There was a huge mobilization really around it, all of which kind of, like you said, at the end of the emergency, it's over, for the most part. Now there was some, like the home test kits, the antigen tests, and that super. But it's a response to one big kind of beacon in the market. Whereas there are so many chronic conditions that are, that are there constantly. Pretty much everybody in the population now is a patient of something.
Yeah.
That we need those. They're here for the long term as opposed to these short ones. And yeah, I don't know what my point is. It's probably that there's so many gaps that just haven't been identified yet for these kind of at home point of care or early diagnostics. I think early is the key, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I suppose one of the things, or what I was saying or alluding to really, was that it's raised the awareness of diagnostics and the importance of diagnostics in healthcare systems around the world. I think that the general public had just sort of never thought about it. It didn't really cross their mind. It was part of a process. Whereas now everyone knows about COVID, and they all know about, the lateral flow tests and PCR and all this. So we've all become our own little experts. So, that it's really raised the awareness. And one thing with the IVD regulation is that a lot of diagnostics are being up-classified. So Stephen, you and I were talking just before we went live that, under the old directive, only about 10-15% of diagnostic companies needed to engage with a notified body. Now with the IVDR coming in, it's going to be about 85% of these diagnostic companies will need to engage with the notified body. And that's because their diagnostics are being up-classified from self-declared, the low risk, all the way up to a much higher risk classification. And COVID is actually a point in case in that a lot of most of those diagnostics for COVID were self-declared, so very, very low risk. And now with the IVDR, they're going to be up-classified, a lot of them to the highest risk, which is Group D. So a huge shift in requirements that you need to comply with and responsibilities. So I can see that a lot of these emergency use solutions will just be here for the emergency, and then they will probably be withdrawn from the market because companies won't want to continue through to full compliance.
There's a kind of parallel with medical device regulation as well, whereas there are new regulatory requirements that have to be met for products that are already on the market. So existing products now have to go back and update their regulatory requirements, which it's like, as you've just said there, it's kind of almost starting again, and in some cases it's probably not worth the company's while.
Exactly. Yeah, some harsh decisions need to be made, unfortunately.
Yeah, but I mean, it's the other crazy statistics that are numbers that I saw when we were talking just before we kicked off, or that you were telling me, is the amount of the percentage of clinical decision making that relies on a diagnostic versus the spend in healthcare on diagnostics. I don't know. I'm going to butcher this, but it's something like 70% to 80% of decisions are made on a diagnostic result, and only something like less than 10% of the budget is on diagnostics. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yes, indeed. So before we move towards the end of last question, I would like to remind all our audiences that this is the last session as part of the IVDR Celebration Week. And tomorrow at 2 p.m., we will be live again with the closing ceremony, where there are some very important takeaways for IVD manufacturers and to make sure that your IVD are ready. So don't forget to tune in tomorrow at 2 p.m. and join us for the closing ceremony. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to put them up in the comment section or on our emails, and we will make sure that those questions are answered either tomorrow during the ceremony or later by email. And yes, now moving to the last question. Now, this question will be to both of you, but first to Stephen. Stephen, can you give 3 takeaways for the EU IVD manufacturers?
I'd say it's engage with your user cohort early. As Greer said, then the second will be is to engage then with the regulatory person early to understand what your process is. And I think the third one really is to see the first two. And if once I think once you've engaged with your user base and you understand what your regulatory pathway is, then everything else should kind of fall into place in a very broad sense.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And now passing the same question to Greer. Greer, what would be your quick? I guess you have given more than 3 throughout the week, but again, you have to give us 3 more takeaways for EU IVD manufacturers.
Well, some of this I'm going to reiterate really from other sessions, but it's absolutely define your device. You may find it's not even medical, so make sure that you know what you're committing to, especially if it is medical. So define the device, and then that will determine your classification. So determine your classification, definitely do your regulatory strategy, and that feeds into so many other things, other areas as well. If you don't do your regulatory strategy, how on earth are you going to know what's involved in the journey, and how can you apply for funding? And just remember that you are not alone. There are places like Health Innovation Ireland, that the hub, that are absolutely fantastic, available, lots of resource, lots of expertise, and just go and talk to people. You're not in a silo, you're not alone. There are lots of very helpful specialists out there who are more than willing to point you in the right direction or offer you advice.
Thank you so much, Greer. And yes, once again, for all our audiences, IVDR Celebration Week is brought to you by Meditia and powered by Global Regulatory Services in association with our resource partners, which includes Galway Chamber, Metalink Midlands, Affordability Development, Cenon Health Solutions, GS1 Ireland, Health and Innovation Hub Ireland, Embassy of India, Dublin, Ireland, and with all the experts and with all the resource partners, we want to make sure that you and the entire medtech ecosystem is #IVDR ready. And before we close on, Greer and Stephen, are there any more closing comments that you would like to add on?
Goodness, I think I've said it all. Don't be put off by the regulations. There is a huge ecosystem out there, a huge network that is there to support you. We don't want wonderful diagnostics and technology disappearing off the market because you can't cope with moving from directives to regulations. It is possible, and just take it one step at a time.
And further to that, the entire kind of health tech, medical technology space, diagnostics, the ecosystem in Ireland is very strong. The supports are there, not just from a regulatory side and that, but importantly from kind of financial side too. The Enterprise Ireland are, they're there to help. There are a lot, and there's a lot of expertise in the country as well. So, as you said, don't leave it on the shelf there withering away. Just have a go, bring it out and see.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen and Greer, for taking out time from your busy schedules, and you're sharing all these insights with all our audiences who watched us live and who will be also watching our recorded sessions. Once again, a big thanks to the audience and to our presenters. And with this, I will be closing this session. See you again tomorrow at 2 p.m. with the closing ceremony of the IVDR Celebration Week. Till then, take care and make sure you are IVDR ready. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.